All right, so this is content area 9. It's a really quick content area. So, it's just there's not going to be an emphasis on this with on the AP exam. So we're going to just do it this way, and I'll walk you guys through it. You may have some questions, of course, some multiple choice questions about it on the exam. You might also have possibly could have an FRQ. You're going to notice when we're talking about it, it's going to be very similar to what we see with content area 5, Indigenous Americas, content area 6, Africa, and then parts of content area 7 with West and Central Asia. So we're going to see more emphasis on shamanist type nature spirits. We're going to see ritual. We're going to see objects that have life force, ancestral worship. So some of the things we've talked about before. So it won't be totally new stuff. So for our essential knowledge, the main situations or influences we're going to see on the Pacific are going to have to do with either something man of the natural world, right, ecological, some sort of social structure, social hierarchy, and then any sort of external influence or post-contact would be colonialism, of course, missionizing through the region, and commerce. The Pacific is islands. Okay, y'all probably know that. And the majority of the materials we're going to see are going to be organic materials as well as trade materials. I highlighted that word Lapita because you may remember our Lapita terracotta fragment from content area 1. This is different than what we might have seen before. There at the very end, we're going to actually see some artwork that is meant to be destroyed once it is used. And so the idea there is that the lasting memory, right, is going to be what is significant, or what is to be really the art, right? The process or the experience or the performance was the art. Of course, the ocean is going to be prominent because that's that's where we are here in the Pacific. Think about how it connects and separates people. So when people groups live on different islands, of course, there is a barrier of water between them, but we also have this idea that it's a shared experience. And then we're going to see emphasis on navigation and ships. Talked about all this different social hierarchy, relations, ancestral lineage through objects, things that relate to deities or leaders. We'll see an emphasis on ritual dress, so costuming, tattoos, which we'll talk about. And then I know we've talked about this idea of a life force or a energy of a person, or you might think of it as the soul of a person or the essence of a person. And so with much of the Pacific, that is called mana down there in that last paragraph. And then this idea of protecting that energy or that spirit is called tapu. So the tapu is actually a wrapping or a container or a covering that protects the mana, being the life force. So it actually needing to be covered or protected somehow. So mana and tapu. So certainly if you had a Pacific question on the AP exam that was an FRQ, you're going to probably want to reference either mana or tapu. So much, as I mentioned, about the Pacific arts is about performance. Again, very similar to what we've seen in West Africa and what we saw in Indigenous Americas. This idea of rituals to address all of the senses, right? It's one of the things we talked about when we talked about worship, even within, the early Christian context, and this thought that the act of worship could appeal to all the senses. So taste, through maybe a certain meal or communion, this idea of sound, right? Do you hear singing? Do you hear an organ? Do you hear drums? Do you hear a chant, depending on different faiths, right? Or is it silence? The idea of course, what you see is going to vary. Different incenses and smells used in different rituals, and touch different positions. Right, in some faiths, you're laying prostrate on the floor, you're kneeling, or you're walking, you're circumambulating. Right, so that being part of that experience. All right, so we're going to look at our first piece. This is Nen Madol. And Nen Madol or Nan Madol is in Micronesia. So remember, for your T1, you're going to need to be as specific as possible. And so saying Pacific, I mean, that's a really large area when we're thinking about the geographical boundary. So definitely, if that's all you can remember, put Pacific, but then try to go ahead and pick. You're going to just make it up if you don't know for sure. So Micronesia, Polynesia, or Melanesia. So this is Micronesia. The Sondalar dynasty is the more specific people group. And you can see from the date that this site was used for many generations. It is made with the black basalt stone that breaks apart or is cut in these really, really interesting prismatic shapes. And so it's really fascinating. And then as we get this aerial view here, you can see these delineated spaces. So yes, it's nature, right? And it's the natural world, but see how man has come along and created these geometric sections of the space. And so Nan Madol is a civilization, a city, a place built on top of a coral reef. And so you can see in that picture, right, the upper left corner where it's really, really dark, that's going to be more of your deeper waters. And then you can see right up next to the land how it becomes that lighter value. And so that is going to be where where the civilization kind of built on top of. So definitely made in the natural world, and it's a civilization, it's a city, it's a place, a location. If you want to open up the slides and watch that video there, you can. It's kind of looks almost like somebody's home movie, but it will show you some of the different sites there, which are interesting, kind of let you see a little bit closer up. There's one that really freaks me out. It's the meditation chamber, and it's like barely big enough for the guy to like squeeze down into. And so that part's a little freaky. Okay, this is the only ancient city we know of built on a coral reef. We have no idea how they did it because of the weight of these prismatic columns. It's hard to imagine how they were stacked. And so when we generally think about a column, right, we think about it as this vertical, but these columns were actually done like logs, right, like Lincoln logs. And so they're stacked up. So it's I don't know of another site that looks like this. It's extremely unique in the way it was built. There's no carving here. There's no art that has lasted other than the structures themselves. So we don't know for sure what their art, as maybe we think about it, would have looked like outside of rituals. The Sondalar ruled the island for over 1,000 years. They were very much into ritual and sacred and a very structured, strong military. But they were also seen as cruel. They were very antagonistic here in their site. Not a lot of visitors here. The people who live here now are called Pohnpei, and that's different from Pompeii, but it sounds pretty close. So here is a picture of what one of these kind of the side of one of these edifices look like. So you can see how shallow the water is, right? You're coming up on this coral reef. And then the structures are just these stacks of these, long pieces of basalt. So what's our content, right? What are we looking at? 92 artificial islands spread over 200 acres. High, of course, salt content at these areas, and it creates this climate, this space that's really good for the mangrove to grow. And so that kind of lines, they kind of line the edges there. Coral flats. The columns of stone that they're building with, you know, are these prismatic shapes stacked up like we talked about. You have the green of the jungle, you have the blue green of the water, and then their architecture is black, right? Like gray black. So it has an intimidation to it, or an intimidating look to it. All right. The population in its heyday was about 30,000, which means that when we think about the effort that would go into building these structures, it was very intentional. It was a very, it was a large effort to do that. And somehow they did it without pulleys, levers, or metal to get them into place. Here is a graphic that will show you kind of how they built. So again, 92 different kind of geometric shaped islands. Nomadal means spaces between. And so we can tell specifically, this was referring to this idea of a controlled built space right here off our natural formation of the island. So this was a site where the king could do rituals. It was also a site where the king and the head of the military could plan strategically for spaces. And so just like Cuzco or just like Versailles, this is a site that is laid out and according to specific functions depending on the space, right? Or the Alhambra, same thing. So parts of the city are for the king's ritual. Parts of the city are where the priest would live. Parts of the city are where you know, the military and the king would meet. And so very specific functions to these spaces. There's a picture of the building. So again, they kind of alternate between the levels, how they're laying these prismatic pieces. Let's see, I think we talked about that. Mostly the space is going to be used by the priest, by ritual spaces, or the king, and then the military. If there's anything else. Oh, we do know that there are some spaces here for funerary that they did bury on Non-Madal, and so they built up tombs. We know there are meditation places. Megalith architecture, right? Megalith just means big stone, right? Big stone architecture. That must look like a parking lot curb or something, right? Stacked up. All right. So moving on, we're looking at the Moai, and I'm sure you guys have seen the Moai. You've probably called them the Easter Island heads, which is what they're commonly called. So this is at Rapa Nui, which is Easter Island. And you can probably remember that when you see these, right? Easter Island heads, you know that. So Moai are the figures themselves, and the platform that they are on is called the Ahu, A-H-U. Volcanic tufa, like we talked about with the Etruscans, it is a softer rock, more like pumice. And then basalt is another volcanic rock. The Moai that are in this picture here have on hats, or they might be hairstyles, right? These elaborate hairstyles, but there's some sort of adornment made in a different color stone that sit on top of the head. Moai. Okay, so Moai just means statue. These statues were probably carved to commemorate important ancestors. They have found about 887 of them. And the majority of them are made from volcanic tufa. We do know that the older moai are a little bit more simplistic in their carving, and then they get a little bit more advanced the more recent they get. And then Christianity, when Christianity comes along and you have the missionizing period throughout the Pacific, of course, there are going to be many changes. And one of those changes is going to be, just like we've seen in other cultures, this iconoclast, if you will, type period where they're going to try to get rid of these indigenous beliefs. Now, we can say, okay, well, that's because the Christians viewed them as idols. Perhaps it also has to do, remember, rituals connect people, right? Rituals connect cultures. And so if we get rid of those, then that's going to be a way to start breaking apart those indigenous cultures. And so many of them were toppled or destroyed in the 19th century. So Ahu's the platform, talked about that. Thinking about the form, they are idealized, they are stylized, they have a very heavy brow, long ears, really oval nostrils, a really prominent clavicle, right? Collarbone. The arms are wedded to the body, right? So that they don't easily break. Prominent nipples. Okay, so why Easter Island? This, of course, was named by an explorer who came across the site and saw the island on Easter Sunday of 1722. So it was named Easter Island. They called themselves Rapa Nui. College Board, of course, is going to accept either of those. In classic Polynesian context, we have an aristocracy with hereditary chiefs, right? This ancestral line of chiefs who were given political and social authority over the commoners. So set up pretty much what we saw through much of Western Europe, right? You have some sort of leader and then some sort of commoner, different classes. See if there's anything else here I was going to say. Oh, so these moai represent different ancestral chiefs. And so this idea that this stone, this carving has within it a supernatural power and essence that is going to then protect the community, even after the death of that ancestral chief. Right. And so these were seen as these kind of forefathers guarding the island. The Moai's chiefs, the kings, the leaders, consider themselves direct descendants of the gods, which, hello, I mean, that's what we saw in Greece. That's what we saw in Rome. That's what we saw with the Incan. We see that a lot where people feel divinely or treated as if they're divinely appointed or even just divinely descended, right? All right, so how do you do this? So they would start by a group of them. So this is a collective art, right? Quarrying a rectangular block using sticks made of or picks made of a harder basalt. They would rough it out. They would add the fine details. Then they would use ropes and levers to slide the moai down the slope. Okay. So it's created flat on its back, and then it would be raised up, and then they would finish the carving. Likely they helped move it with a wooden sled or rollers. Took probably 40 people to move an average sized moai. But then when you consider all that goes into the quarrying and the carving and all those days, you're looking at 300 to 400 people to create something like this. And then you're, also have to consider feeding these people and growing the crops to produce the rope to weave, to create rope to pull these into place. I mean, it's a huge, tremendous effort. All right. Oh, something interesting about them that I didn't have here in the slides. But the moai actually face the island, right? They face the island. That's kind of interesting. Okay, so let's go to Hawaii. This is the Ahu'ula, which just means feather cape. Feather cape. And I love it because that tells you exactly what the function is and a lot about the form. So this is a fiber netting covered with little individually tied on or adhered feathers. This should probably make you think of the Aztec feather headdress that we saw in content area 5. So our important color here in the Pacific, specifically in Hawaii, is red. Red is going to be a masculine, aggressive, powerful color. Kind of how it's viewed even today in most contexts, most context. This is an object that would only be worn by men, only worn by men. And specifically, these are going to be leaders who are going into either some sort of ceremony or battle. So this is ritual wear. This is not everyday wear, obviously, because it's feathers, which are going to, potentially be fragile. Yellow starts to become significant as well because of the rarity of just that bright yellow color for birds, for feathers. So this looks maybe like it's a collar or something. This is a cape, right? So it wraps around the back. Right, I think we talked about this. Feather bundles on a net backing. Fit close up to the neck. This one is semicircular. At other times in history, you see the trapezoid shape. And then once we start to have post contact with people outside of these indigenous groups, you start to see the feathered cloaks. Same thing again we saw with feathered objects coming from the indigenous Americas that are being taken or purchased as souvenirs or given as gifts from indigenous to European individuals. They are certainly wealthy, expensive objects. We don't know how this cape ended up in England exactly, but colonizing is really how it ends up in England. All right, so for this, we'd want to say ritual, right, as a theme. Masculine, right? This is going to be something that is going to be worn by men. Women could help make them, but they're going to be worn by men. This is going to be something that those symbols on it are going to relate to different families, different people groups, right? Different neighborhoods or communities. Power and authority, right? This is an object that is about the strength of the wearer and his ancestral line. All right, staff god. This is a special piece. I like this one. So this is the Rarotonga from the Cook Islands. Cook Islands, named, of course, after the British explorer, James Cook. But Rarotonga is going to be the indigenous name. So we talked about, with our essential knowledge, I said that we're going to see natural materials, right? Organic materials. So wood, feathers, different local fibers, of course, that makes sense. So the object that is on that vertical that's on the left, that is the whole thing. That's the whole piece. And then on the right, we have a zoomed in close up of just that little part at the top, right? That wooden carved part. So we're seeing like a close up, a detail image there. So in our essential knowledge, as I mentioned here at the beginning, we have these kind of two facets that we have to consider. We have the mana, which is the soul or the essence of a person. And then the mana, this essence, this life force, has to be protected and covered and preserved by a tapu, right? So tapu, T-A-P-U, is going to be the protector of this essence, this idea. All right, so we got that. Now we're going to talk about tapa. Okay, tapa being this material that is wrapped around this object. So this is like a big bundle. If you've seen those like smudge sticks or anything, right? This wrapped tight bundle. And so it tells us in the title, this is a god, right? This is a god, which means it's going to have all of the indications we would see with like the Shiva sculpture, right? Or a Buddha. Okay, so the essence of the god is within this object. And so all of this wrapping is protecting that god's essence, right? All right. So we know, of course, that the British show up with a missionizing society, of course. And so that is how many of these objects ended up back in the UK. This object has to do, of course, certainly, right, with divinity, right, a divine being, but it also has to do with power and authority, specifically through ancestral worship and significant genealogical lines and male power. And so that's why we have an emphasis on the phallic shape and then repeated male figures or figures of fertility with these objects. So God sticks are usually, they can come in different sizes, you know, from a foot. This one's really, really large. This one is 13 feet tall. So if we go back and we look at this picture, right, that picture there on the left, that vertical, this is 13 feet tall. And so you can see that that piece of the top is just maybe a little over, well, a foot and a half, something like that. Okay, so this is made of ironwood. Ironwood is a wood that's popular in tropical areas. It does not burn easily. It's a very dense wood with a kind of a high, I guess, oil content. So it doesn't burn easily. So ironwood, and then it's wrapped in these layer after layer after layer of bark cloth, right? Bark cloth. Bark cloth is called tapa. T-A-P-A. So in our media there, where it says tapa, that's the bark cloth. And then that upper part that we looked zoomed in is these small repeated carved figures, the god form, and then at the other end was a wooden carved phallus, right? And so this phallus, this penis form, was put on there as a symbol of power and a symbol of fertility and a symbol of ancestral pride. But then when the Christians come along, you know, they're knocking those things off because they're seen as obscene. So here is the top. It's a face and profile. So you have the eye, looks almost African, right? With this kind of closed eye with a circle around it. The feather bundles coming out of a piercing in the ear, very stylized. We have a mouth. And then we have these little figures carved below, these repeated figures. Some of the figures might be in the act of birthing a child, which was, of course, go into that concept of fertility. And then at the opposite end of this god stick is the phallic form, and we can see that here, right? So this would be pretty typical of what the objects would look like. You have a skull or a face at one side, you have repeated objects, you have this indeterminate or, you know, up to the artist length of bark cloth wrapped stick in the middle, and then at the bottom you have the phallus. So here's our whole object there. And we know that this tapa, as it was wrapped up, this bark cloth contained different feathers that were laid in and kind of wrapped up with the material, pieces of shell. And so this relates, these objects, these little bits relate to the spirit or the soul of this staff god. We also know from a diary entry that this exact staff god was presented along with 13 others to a visiting Christian minister May of 1827, right? So we have that very specific context with this work. Now, we also know because of a sketch that this and the other 13 were presented vertically, kind of coming out of a kind of a stand that was carried, and then that they were laid down. And so that this was brought up, you know, vertical and then laid down flat. It's not a great picture at all. It's hard to find this picture, but this is the imagery of what these objects were looked like being brought in. So we can see the indigenous people. You can see the Europeans there in the middle, kind of in that clearing. Laying in front of them are these staff gods, and then you can see what it looks like when they are brought in. So they're brought in kind of as an offering and then laid out in front. Here is this piece in the museum, and so you can see that they're doing some restoration on it, but it remains wrapped up, right? And so we get an idea of scale here. This giant bundle, just wrap of bark cloth there in the middle, with little, you know, talisman and things wrapped in with it. And then, so this is the phallus end. So the phallus has been removed by the Christians. But we can see where that stick, it's going to go into and be in the middle of this bundle, right? So this represents the God. The essence of God is in the middle. And so all this wrapping is protecting the vitality of that God. There are the figures. Again, these two that have their legs up are kind of presumed as being in labor. So that's one interpretation about fertility. We really don't have any other staff gods that are this large. So this one is rare. It's probably one of the most sacred objects to come out of the Rarotanga. Has to do with fertility. We talked about that, and it would be made by men and women. Specifically, the carving is going to be made by men, and then the making of the bark cloth and the wrapping can be done by women. So it's a collaborative piece as well. We talked about all that. All right. This work always kind of confuses, not confuses me, but just, I don't know. Okay, so this work is from the Caroline Islands. I have a daughter named Caroline. So the Caroline Islands, and this work is just called Female Deity. I know it's not very specific, but that's what it's called because we don't know for sure the name. I guess her name's Caroline. You just call her Caroline, you'll remember it. So this is a wood carving. I'm sure you guys can tell that. It does incorporate some negative space, you know, between the body and the arm, but the hands are wedded to the sculpture. And so we get that sense of it being a, you know, a sturdy object. And I tried to find some pictures of it from the side and the back. So it has this kind of strange butt on it that is really like protrudes out. We know it's a woman because of the breast and the pubic triangle, which we see quite clearly from the front. So this object obviously is not realistic proportions. It is idealized. It is godlike, symmetrical, emphasis on right, like the smoothness of geometric forms. Has a very I don't know, like futuristic look to it almost. It's wedded. It's all, or I'm sorry, it's all carved from one piece of wood, and so the hands are wedded, but it's also wedded to that base. Wasn't painted, right? It was made just like this. Remember when you guys see wood objects, except for the Russian Pietà, the majority of them are going to be 18th century or more recent. Okay, so the Caroline Islands there in the Pacific are part of a larger group. All of this area that we call Micronesia is going to be small islands where there is going to be cross communication between these different people groups. And so this is going to be an area where the cultures have converged with other islands in these areas. And then when you add the Europeans to the mix, you have even more converging cultures. So we assume this is a god, right? It's a deity. So that would be a sacred object, a divine object. All right, so the tradition of this people group, this oral tradition says that the people left Samoa, and if we go back, you can see Samoa here, right up here's Hawaii. Okay, so the people left Samoa and they kind of set off to develop their own cultural context. They found some uninhabited islands, Nuku'oro, but with them they brought some of that social hierarchy and social order that they had when they were in these more populated islands of the Samoan. This area is kind of called an outlier because it's maybe not as similar to some of the other Polynesian areas. They were known for canoe building, of course. I mean, that would be just a guarantee for where they are. Navigation, again, if you want to come back alive, you need to be good with navigating and weaving. Small area, so about 400 inhabitants. We know that there was some some converging cultures with the Europeans as early as 1830, which allowed there to be metal tools. And the metal tools are going to be what leads to objects that have more refinement to the carving, perhaps more detail. There seems to be a connection with Nan Madol. There had been someone who had converted to Christianity who had lived at Nan Madol. She was Pohnpei, and she took Christianity back to the Caroline Islands. Remember that when an object like this is removed from its original context, we lose the essence of the intention of this object and its original function, right? And we don't know for sure what the exact original function is, other than something divine, something ritualistic according to faith. But when it's taken away, and instead when there is a missionizing period, then these objects are either destroyed or they're taken off the island, or they're just put in a box and they're not viewed in the same sacred way that they had been. So likely this went with some sort of oral storytelling, or this went with, a ritual or performance, something like that. We'll see a variety of sizes with these. They all have a very similar, short leg, long torso form. The majority of them are women. This really kind of ovular head, very, very simple. And then this really kind of protruding and then flat butt. Oof, that's a lot on one slide. Sorry, guys. All right, so these figures, this one likely, and the majority of them that have been found are female. We know that they were placed in little temple houses, and these little temple houses, it kind of makes me think of like a, I don't know, like a little shrine within a temple space, and they would be decorated with different beads. Remember, different weaving that took place here. The ceremony that one of the ceremonies that was celebrated in the Caroline Islands was celebrating the the constellation of the Seven Sisters. And so it's possible that this could be in line with something to do with that constellation. And then the spirit of either a god or an ancestor could rest in these objects. European artists, of course, really loved the simplicity of the form and kind of hijacked that abstraction. Of course, we know Picasso did that with African and ancient Iberian sculptures. European artists, when they saw these objects, thought that they represented this kind of pure essence of form, that they considered them primitive and they considered them so different from what they saw coming from the academy. And so these wooden figures from the Carolina Islands really impact a lot of 20th century, especially early 20th century painting and sculpture. So these are some 20th century sculptures that are influenced by these deities. So thinking about how the idea or the concept of ideal form can vary by culture, right? We'd call both of these ideal, but they have this very different presentation, right? So remember when you use that word ideal, ideal doesn't just earn you a form point, right? Because ideal could look like the image on the left or it could look like the image on the right. You have to be more specific. What is ideal to that culture? Obviously very different there. Okay, the Bouc mask. So this is from the Torres Strait. It is made from turtle shells, wood, different kind of grass fibers and woven fibers, feathers, and seashells. All right, so we're gonna watch this. Maybe, hopefully.
We're in the Metropolitan Museum of Art looking at a fabulous mask that was made by people who lived on an island in the Torres Strait. This is a body of water between New Guinea and Australia that has hundreds of islands, most of which are uninhabited. This is from a particular island called the Mabuyag Island.
What we have here is a turtle shell mask divided into 3 registers. In the bottom, we have a human face. Above it, the face and body of a bird, and above that, feathers.
Now,
Like
it's only in the
totem
Torres Strait
stack.
that we find masks made out of this very precious material of turtle shell.
In this particular case, we have a frigate bird depicted, and we have a face that has raffia attached to it, as though it were hair. And in fact, in other examples, it really is human hair.
What I notice is that we have a lot of pieces that have been stitched together. The piece that forms the face, 3 decorative pieces that surround that. We have a piece underneath, another piece in the back, and then the bird itself is made up of many pieces of turtle shell.
And in addition to turtle shell, we also have feathers and shell and raffia that add to the texture and the materiality of this piece.
And of course, this would only have been one part of an elaborate costume used in a masquerade.
It would have been seen in motion in front of an audience when it was actually used.
Right, music, those feathers on the top moving in the wind, and the raffia that we see for the hair also moving. So we're seeing it in a very static way, which is very unnatural.
And it's likely the dancer was making the gestures of a bird.
So who's represented here? Art historians conjecture that perhaps this is a face of a hero, someone who lived in the past, but who did supernatural deeds who's being remembered here.
It could also be an ancestor. It could be an older person because we have this lovely lattice work around the sides of the face and the bottom, which suggests a beard. Somebody important in your lineage who you would want to honor through this mask.
And perhaps that person was associated with the frigate bird on the top of the mask, or perhaps the frigate bird was associated in some way with the wearer of the mask.
And in that sense, the bird could be seen as a totem, that is a mythological creature that connected to a particular lineage or a family. Maybe it was an animal that they didn't hunt. Maybe it was an animal that they regarded as unique and special.
And so this mask likely connected the wearer, connected the culture to supernatural, to something beyond the physical world.
Because we have to ask ourselves why the artist created it. Why did they spend so much time carving this, putting it together? We know turtle shell was actively traded, and that European sailors in particular were interested in collecting tortoise shell in the early 1800s. We know that by the late 1800s, the presence of missionaries had made this practice almost obsolete. In fact, they asked the Torres Strait Islanders to burn their masks, to destroy them. So the only examples that we have today are in collections that anthropologists, ethnographers, sailors, missionaries, folks that were outsiders in the Torres Straits might have collected.
In the end, we're not sure whether this dates to the late 19th century after this area had been Christianized. And so we're not sure if this is an object that was made for the people themselves or was made to be exported for tourists and collectors.
Because there are accounts of turtle shell masks in the Torres Straits, we assume that these were fairly important. They have a long history, a long tradition, and we know from another account in the 1930s that they were kept in special houses of stone. So it suggests that they were items that had prestige, and I would love to know more about those circular pieces on the wings.
They almost look like propellers. The whole sculpture, this whole mask, gives me a feeling of flight and of upward movement.
And while we may not be completely satisfied with understanding the cultural context of this piece, we can actually really appreciate it formally in this space.
All right, so kind of like we talked about before with our little female deity from the Carolina Islands, that there is a special kind of presentation, or I'm sorry, storage for this, that they were given these little stacked stone homes to hold them when they weren't in use. And so they were something that was revered and thought of as, you know, important, obviously. It makes me think kind of the transformation mask from the Kwakwaka'wakw that we saw. Okay, this is Haiapu Tapa. So Haiapu is the name of this painting, this painted bark cloth. And then remember, tapa just means bark cloth. So we have some, might be a little confusing. So mana, M-A-N-A, mana is the life force or the spirit of an object. Tapu, T-A-P-U, tapu is anything that covers or protects the mana of an object. So in our staff god that we looked at from the Rarotonga island, or the Rarotonga people, remember it's wrapped in tons of tapa, bark cloth, and that tapa is acting as a tapu to protect the mana. So tapa can be tapu, but not all tapu is tapa. Okay. So bark cloth can be a wrapping to protect the mana, but not all mana protector is made of bark cloth, right? So this is a freehand painting done with a organic ink on top of a piece of bark cloth. This would be made from mulberry bark cloth. And you can tell from the looking at the overall shape and the patterns that this is freehand, right? That this is something that somebody's doing without a compass and protractor and, making it exact. This is absolutely freehand. We talk about balance in this work. It's that radial balance. All right, so this will be a woman's craft. So harvesting the bark, which is made from paper sheets or bark sheets pulled off of the mulberry tree that are then soaked in water and then hammered into a cloth, and then painting the design on top. Again, tapa can be tapu. Hopefully that makes sense to you. Geometric patterns, very abstract. It's radial design overall. These would be used as gift objects. They can be used as clothing, bedding, wall hangings. They could be, like we saw with the staff god, used to wrap images of deities. And they were also used in a funerary context, kind of like we saw maybe the funeral banner of Lady Di. This idea of having a covering for the coffin that's specific to that individual. So this is women's craft, which we don't usually or always see. Usually women weave, this free hand painting, whereas men are carvers and usually builders. These are sometimes referred to as women's wealth. So if you had to write about this piece, working that kind of phrase of women's wealth is certainly appropriate. They could be used as part of a dowry. They could be used as a inheritance. They can be something that represent cultural or social hierarchical importance, or something that is done actually as a commerce, an exchange for goods. So I was trying to think of a similarity, perhaps if we go back to late 1800s, early 1900s, how American women viewed quilts as something that represents their wealth and importance and status, something that could be used as a trade object or bartering object, and then something that could be made as part of a present, either a wedding present or funerary or new baby. So this is from an island, just south of Samoa. Okay, sorry, I'm on my husband's computer. We don't know for sure exactly about this specific hayapo or painted bark cloth. Look at that, how shocking. The majority of these were collected by missionaries, British missionaries. So that's typically what we see with the objects preserved out of the Pacific, not just Polynesia, but the Pacific. So geometric patterns, to me, this looks like somebody who's doodling, maybe in class or something. It has elements that are organic, like nature, leaves, some flowers that might have some specificity, and then it has a lot of geometric, flat, pattern-based work, some hatching and some filling in of line. So this is a traditional indigenous object, but there are Naian artists who still work with some of these patterns as a way to look back to their cultural heritage and update or give a contemporary version. So I thought these were interesting. These are by an indigenous artist named John Poole, who takes some of these traditional designs and makes them for a contemporary audience. So these different motifs, these different designs, we may not understand what they all mean, but they have cultural significance. So I would link this work with the painted elk hide out of the Shoshone Reservation. by Kodzi Cody in Content Area 5, Indigenous Americas. All right. Tamati Wakanin. So Tamati Wakanin is the name of the chief in the painting, And we know the artist, Gottfried Lindauer. So this is a good old oil on canvas, what we'd expect to see as a European style of work. But the culture being represented is the Maori. And so this is a Maori chief, Tamati Wakanin. When I say this is the chief, I mean, it's the painting of the chief, but it's also the chief, right? Because we have to remember that objects can contain the mana, the life force of an individual. And so that this painting can be more than a pictorial representation, but can actually take on the essence of the ancestor. You can see that kind of clumping of feathers hanging from his staff. That's kind of like what we saw at the top of the staff god, right? From the Rarotonga. All of the intense, symmetrical facial tattoo. We can look at a tattoo and say, well, that's just decoration, right? Tattoo on my arm. Well, that's decoration. Yes, but in this culture, in the Maori culture, it can actually be tapu, not tapa. Tapa's bark cloth. Tapu, right? So that it functions, the tattoo functions as a wrapping, a covering, a protecting of his mana. So that it's each individual, you have your own life force, your own vitality. Now, the more important you are in society, he's an ancestral chief, the more mana you have, right? This more importance, and you need to protect it. And so tattoos on the body can actually protect the life force of self. Also, be sure to check out his costume, his kind of woven grass and feather costume, and then look at the eye on his staff. It's pretty cool. And his earring, it's also cool. So we have this painting then that got to be European, right? But the subject matter, the content is Indigenous Maori, right? So these converging cultures here. And then you have this stately, this powerful, this revered individual. Looks very confident, right? All right, so the portrait of Sensukju that we talk about in Content Area 8, this idea that this painting of this leader actually contains the ancestral soul or essence of Sensukju in the same way that Tamati Wakanin's essence can be in this painting, right? In the actual canvas with the oil painting on top. It can represent part of him. So I would link these two as significant. When we look at a painting, I can't even think of it. Okay, when we look at the, a painting of King Louis, or when we look at the painting of Elizabeth Louise Vigée Brune from this kind of late Rococo natural art that we saw in France. No one looks at, in our European and Western culture, we don't look at that and go, well, her soul is in that painting. No, it's a painting of her, right? Painting Marie Antoinette. But in these cultures, in these specific groups, the essence of the individual is actually in this material, in this recreation of them. All right, so this is a sketch that was utilized as the basis for the painting. Oh, that's it. I think I had more to tell you about that piece, but I think if I'm remembering, it's in an article. I will share that with you guys separately. I thought I had it linked in here. Sorry about that. All right, so let's move on to, I'll get you guys more information about why Gottfried is painting those, what he's doing. So let's move on to Micronesia, the Marshall Islands. This is a navigation chart. So it's a map. It's a map of sorts. So this is pieces of wood, sticks that have been tied together with fiber. And then there's little tiny bits of shell that you can see, those white spaces that are marking different locations. Navigation charts are still made mostly as souvenirs to sell to non-native people. So in the old days, before, the iPhone, people would actually use paper maps when they were going someplace. They would, actually fold out the whole big thing. And then as you drove, you would be able to be like, oh, turn here, get on this highway, whatever. And that would get you to your location. One of the interesting things about these navigation charts is they were not actually taken on the canoe with the person using them. Instead, these would go in the home and they would be memorized so that when the individual is going from one island to the next, or from one region to another, or even just within the island, right, going from one side to another, you would have this memorized so that you would know where to go. So part of this chart, the part that's really more grid-like, right, your horizontals and your verticals, that is really kind of just the matrix to hold this object together. And then the pieces that are at a diagonal or that have this kind of curve to them, those are one of two things. They are either paths that can be taken from one island or one area to the next, or they are water currents, so that in the canoe, you would know where to hit different currents to go a certain way. And so these were invaluable. They were life-saving objects. They were their navigation to get from one place to the next. That's the original function and context. The contemporary context is souvenir, right? Collector items. These are not, of course, the main navigation way that's used anymore. Marshall Islands is an area with a ton of small islands. So 1,000 islands spread over several hundred miles, and the islanders would use canoes to travel from one to the next. Now, this is an area where the topography is very low, and so you could not see necessarily the island that you were going to. And so these navigation maps were really important to help you not to get lost as you went from one place to the next. Mark not only the locations, as I mentioned, of the islands, but also the wave patterns to get there. They would not be carried around. Instead, they were memorized, and you would leave them at home, and then you would memorize it, where to go when you traveled. This is known as a rebileb, which means it's kind of a zoomed out view of the islands. Sometimes you got ones that were a little bit closer up that would cover less area. So this is a zoomed out view, and you can see that by those little shells representing different islands. We know who owned this object. It was Admiral Davis. That wasn't the original owner, but that was the person who ended up collecting this object. So a European man. All right. So this is the Maligan. And the Maligan is a display, a performance, and a mask. We'll talk about that. This is in Papua New Guinea. This is the area where the Ambum stone is from. The Ambum stone from prehistory. It all comes back. So the people group of this exact location of the Maligan are New Ireland. New Ireland. Of course, named after colonizers. This is a wooden carving. The actual face itself is this little wooden carving. It has this kind of carved shell that makes up kind of the side of the head here. You have these woven fibers that make up almost this elaborate hairstyle, almost like a mohawk. And then there's a piece of leather that wraps around so that this tightens around the head and is held on. Remember that this would be ideal, even though it might not be what you imagine, right? These objects are going to represent their culture's ideal. So anytime you guys see a mask, go get a mask on the AP exam, you have to talk about its function as part of a ritual, as part of a costume, right? Masks are not standalone objects that hang on the wall. That's not their intended function. All right, so the Maligan ritual would involve carving of these masks. It would involve carving of totems, and it would involve creating little huts. And these little huts were kind of, or not were, I mean, they're still made, but they're kind of like a temporary stage. So they're closed on three sides and then open across the front. And they are for presenting these masks. So the masks are going to represent, and the totems, different individuals, right? Different individuals who are deceased. And so after this object is used, after the ritual, these huts and some of the masks are just thrown away, just destroyed, because they are so much about a performance and a ritual and a funerary rite and a ceremony, that the memory is what matters, not the keeping of the objects. So Maligan is a cycle of rituals, and it's a lot. It's their main function, as I understand it, is funerary. Their main function is kind of as a group funeral for a group of individuals of a certain class who have passed away. The Maligan ceremony and rites help transition the deceased from this mortal life to the afterlife. They also, of course, as we know, of course, that rituals and ceremonies do, they connect the people. They build up the identity of these different clan groups, just like getting together for someone's wake or funeral might reinforce the families who are there, right? Help them get back in touch with, maybe there's a cousin you haven't seen in a while or something like that, right? They're bringing people together. And then they also help affirm or negotiate transitions in ownership of land or locations or homesteads based on who's going to inherit what. Okay. Maligan sculptures are made to be used once for one Maligan, and then they're destroyed. So they have all this importance to them. And then as soon as they're used, it's like, well, you can just throw that away now. And so that's different than a lot of the masks and objects we look at. Different themes being dealt with: identity, kinship, people coming together, gender, death, the afterlife. We often see representations of oceanic birds and fish, things related to being in the ocean. So the whole ritual kind of starts in the water. It's a way to, again, help the deceased transition to the afterlife, and also to buoy the spirits of those who are still alive, the family and friends who are still alive. The masks, the Mulligan mask can represent different things. They can represent either the deceased ancestor or the geese. The geese is the spiritual double of the individual. So if we go back and we think about the funeral banner of Lady Di from Southeast Asia, from China, Han Dynasty. And we think about this object that this T-shaped banner that was represented and kind of guarded part of Lady Di's soul. Remember, the soul had two parts, and one part stays with the deceased, and the other part goes to the afterlife. Okay, so the gi here is representing the deceased, so that when the person actually puts on the mask, they are becoming their ancestor, or they're becoming the soul of the deceased. They're no longer self. Yes. All right. The owner of a Mulligan object, either the sculpture or the mask, is this idea of a copyright. So once a design is made and used, it cannot be used again. It is specific to the person who it was made for. Mulligans are extremely expensive. And so what they typically do, I say they still do these, but what they typically do is they wait until wait a few months, and then it's everyone of a certain class who is deceased over that time period. So instead of throwing a funeral for one person, waiting until there is several in the community, and then throwing a ritual, a funeral that is for all of those individuals and their families. They have with them a large feast, usually involving pigs, pork. All right, so large feast that would be part of this. And so they're expensive to put on. And they last several days. So again, the purpose to help send the deceased into the afterlife. Mulligan sculptures are contained in those. I described it like a temporary stage setup, right? These little houses that are set up. Each one represents obviously a person, but it doesn't look just like the person. Okay. And then again, once they're used, throw them away. They're done. Oh, I don't know why there's not a picture there. That's weird. Oh, popped up. Okay. So the Mulligan the rites can happen, of course, long after death, depending on how many people it sounds kind of morbid, but how many people you're waiting for before you host the event. There's some different versions of the mask. Isn't this beautiful? This is what the ceremony looks like at the start. The people who are enacting the deceased. So remember, each one of these mask is representing one deceased individual. So the person wearing it is the deceased double, right? Spiritual double. And so they start in the water. They start like at daybreak, and they emerge from the water in these whole costumes, and they run, up onto the shore, and they take part in this banqueting and this ceremony. And it's all very formal, and everyone in the community is involved. Picture. So again, this is a ritual that still takes place. This is one of the Mulligan huts. So again, each one of those totems and masks represents a different person. And then as soon as it's over, those would be destroyed. This one's from 2006. So those are the geese, the spirit doubles. And then when they come out of the water, they run through the town, making certain sounds, different drums play. Part of a performance. They sacrifice the pig, and then you can see the pigs here across the bottom. So each pig represents a family of the deceased, and then this represents kind of the wealth of that family. The pig is shared between family. This is interesting. If the deceased owed someone money or goods when they died, Their debt is forgiven upon their death, according to this group, the New Ireland people. And so what they would do is they would get a section of the deceased person's pig as payment for whatever their debt was. All right, last piece. So this this is an interesting piece. This is not a single work of art. Instead, the work that College Board has given us here is a performance. So this performance is called Presentation of Fijian Mats and Tapa Cloths. Tapa, remember tapa means bark cloth, to Queen Elizabeth II, right? So we know the exact date of this event. This was 1953, and it is in Fiji. So our media here is multimedia. It's going to include the performance, the face makeup, the bark cloths, the dance, and the documentation of the event through photography. College Board's not going to expect you to have all of that data, but they are for media. But you do need to know that it was specifically to hit each of the 5 senses. Okay, so on December 17th of 1953, the newly crowned Queen Elizabeth II and her husband Prince Philip, who just passed away, right, at 99, arrived on the island of Fiji. This is at this point in time a English colony. They stayed 3 days, and this was kind of part of their first royal visit or royal duties as queen and prince. So what we see in this first picture is we see a procession of Fijian women bringing bark cloth, right? Remember I told you guys bark cloth is women's wealth. So bringing this bark cloth, which would be made by women, presented by women as a presentation for her. Think about it like a rolling out the red carpet, right? They're going to roll out this bark cloth as a presentation. Some of them are wearing clothing made of bark cloth. Bark cloth is, as I mentioned, made from mulberry trees that were then beat together. They were hand painted. In the Fiji culture, bark cloth is called masi. In other parts of Polynesia, or the Pacific, it's called tapa. Either is fine. Contemporary context. The making and painting and gifting of bark cloth continues to be an important gift and societal idea in Fiji. So they're still made and given as wedding presents. They still represent women's wealth. Mats are woven, talked about that, and painted. If we think about design here, the simplicity of these abstract designs shows how important and significant the visitor is. So here is Queen Elizabeth arriving right here, and she's walking on woven bark cloth. There's Prince Philip back there. We're not going to watch all of this. So this is footage from the actual day in 1953.
The drums of Fiji sound in welcome to the Queen from across the seas. To the great white ship sail chieftains in heartfelt thanks for 80 years of royal protection. Never before has a reigning British monarch visited these islands. Today, Suva exults in the spirit of empire. And now the great moment. Escorted by Sir Ronald Garvey, the governor of Fiji, and attended by Lady Alice Egerton and the Duke Sequeri, the Queen and her husband enter for the first time into the personal lives of their Pacific Island subjects.
So she's
The
standing
lovable
on
dignity of
bark cloth.
4-year-old Andy May brings a first radiant smile from the Queen. In Fiji, as elsewhere, it is a smile which will be long remembered. Chiefs in ceremonial dress look on as Andy May claps her small hands 3 times, the traditional Fijian mark of respect to honored guests of her people. So to the more formal ceremonies, with first a greeting for Colonel Campbell of the Fiji military forces. Under his command are men who have served the Commonwealth with honor in many campaigns and in many lands. Now escorted by Captain Peter Brandt of New Zealand, Her Majesty inspects the Guard of Honor. The civic welcome by the Mayor and Mayoress of Suva ushers in a day which is predominantly a day of the people. In the streets of the capital, they wait to greet their Queen. 50,000 people of several races united in allegiance to the crown.
So this follows along the whole
Some of the
ceremony.
many ritual acts that bring pageantry to this day.
So you can see those hanging animals in the back. They burn certain things. The queen and the people would drink a certain kind of herb drink. Certain smells are going to come into this. So this entire video, all right, this 23-minute long video documents this work of art. So you might think about performance art of being something that, oh, you know, that's postmodern, or even performance art. We saw that with like Yayoi Kusama, the 1960s. And we see it as this very avant-garde thing. And it can be, but here we see performance art for the then and current Queen of England as very traditional, not avant-garde at all, right? This is traditional. So College Board here is giving us a piece that's really multifaceted. It's probably one of the harder pieces to teach because it does contain all these different things, right? Well, what's our media? What are we looking at? Well, we're looking at a whole event of this day, right? All of these different things are involved in this work of art. So we can't say, well, this work hangs in a museum, right? Like a Robert Smithson with Spiral Jetty, right? It didn't just hang in a museum. Now, elements of it can, photos of it can, the memorabilia of this day can, but what College Board has given us here is an entire presentation, an entire event. And then we can go deeper into that and talk about colonization, and we can talk about convergent cultures and lots of things, right? Okay, let's see if there's anything else. There's a colorized photo of the day. That's it. So I will share with you the other information about Te Matiwakanin that I had not had in the slides for some reason. I'll add it into the slides, but that is it. That is content area 9. And so again, it can be on the exam, absolutely, but it will be a small part if it's on there. All right, bye guys.